Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of Gideon Made It. In today's episode I thought I would quickly show you how I've done this deck that I'm sitting on. I did it about 2 years ago, and as you can see, when you compare the color of the deck to the original oak, it has gone that lovely silver color that oak does if you just leave it alone. Now, I think a lot of people are intimidated by building their own deck because it's a bit of a bigger project, but the flip side of that is that you don't have to work to such tight tolerances as when you build, say, a small wooden box. And as long as you get the substructure right, then the rest is fairly easy if you just work through it conscientiously. Let's go and have a look at a couple of principles. The first principle is to ensure you allow for adequate load bearing. Let's start with the type of wood. The most common timber here in the UK used for building decks is treated softwood graded either as a C16 or a C24. Now the C just stands for conifer, which is the type of tree they use, and the number refers to the strength, with the higher number being the stronger one. For decks you can really use either, especially as you'll be laying them with a relatively short span across the joists, which brings us on to this animation. Here you can see how the multiple deck risers, joists, and noggins are brought together to form a sturdy substructure. In simple terms, all of these need to just be placed close enough together to support the weight of people using it. Let's look at these one by one. For the base, I used these adjustable plastic deck risers by a company called Joplast and spaced them no more than 800 millimeters apart, which gave me a very solid base to work from. Then, next are the joists. I used mostly 50 by 75 millimeter joists and spaced them 400 millimeters apart, as this is the standard for flooring, so I was confident that it would be strong enough to support the deck. And then lastly, do make sure you add these short pieces of wood called noggins roughly about every meter or maybe a little bit less. Note that the function of the noggins isn't to bear any load, but they do prevent the joist from bowing or twisting as the seasons and the temperatures change. To ensure you have a square substructure, it is important to pick the first joist that you're going to fix and then reference all of the other pieces of timber from that master joist. So this, in my case, it made sense to use the long wall of the house, and the piece of wood that goes against that is called a ledger. And you want to make 100% sure that this ledger is absolutely level and very, very solidly attached to the wall, so it doesn't move at all. Now I set the timber against the wall, allowing for the deck boards that still need to slip underneath the doorsill with about, 5 to 7 millimeters of extra gap for air circulation added on. And to level it, I simply used a spirit level and fixed it to the wall using proper roll bolts. So the two joists that I'm fixing to the wall, I'm using these fixings for, which, if you look at it, it might seem a little bit excessive. It is M10 150 millimeter roll bolts that I'm using. But it is not necessarily about the load that it is taking that I'm using these big bolts. It's for the length. So the easiest way to show you is if I quickly draw where it will be sitting. So if you think of that, this bit will go into the wall. And you need to, which I will talk about a little bit later, you need about a 10 millimeter gap for air circulation between the wood and the wall, which is this bit. Which then, if you look at where the 50 millimeters of timber goes, it is exactly the right length of bolt for this application. Now that I had the ledger permanently fixed to the wall, I could reference the two perpendicular rim joists off of it. Here two things are important. Firstly, the rim joist has to be set at an absolute right angle to the ledger. Otherwise, when you come to fix your decking boards, the line of screws you use to fix them will not be straight, and that will just look odd. Now, because of the downpipe in this case being where it is in that corner, it was difficult to fix my perpendicular joist immediately. That just meant I had to add this intermediate joist, square that up first, and then reference the actual joint from that. So hopefully you wouldn't need to do that, but it is just one of those things that crop up as you build, and you just have to work around it. Now, as the only square I had was too small for this job, I recalled about the only trigonometry I understood from school and used Pythagoras' theorem and a piece of string to ensure I set the rim joist to exactly 90 degrees.
The next step was to ensure that there was a sufficient slope towards the garden so that water will run off away from the foundation of the house. Now the internet cites that slope as anywhere between 1 and 2%, so I just went for the golden middle, calculated 1.5% of a slope, which means that over the 2.2 meter span that I have here, it had to drop by 33 millimeters at the furthest end. I just rounded that to 30 millimeters because it's simpler, and also because it equals 5 of these 6 millimeter spaces that I have. Easy way to make sure you get that drop exactly accurate is to calculate your amount of drop, then wedge that amount of spaces underneath the furthest end of the joist, level it as normal with a spirit level, and then simply remove the spaces. That will give you that exact drop that you have calculated.
Squaring up the base is arguably the most important step, but it isn't necessarily difficult. So just take your time, check and recheck until you are completely satisfied with the result. Because if you get this right, the rest is straightforward. The third principle is to ensure you protect against water damage. The chemicals that is used to pressure treat the wood does a good job at protecting it, but it doesn't reach straight through the thickness of the timber, which means that any cut you make will break the integrity of that protective seal. This is not a problem as long as you remember to reseal any cuts you made or holes you drilled with an end grain protector like the one I'm using here by Ron Seal. Also important is to leave air gaps all around the wood so moisture can evaporate naturally. Keeping the timber from touching walls or the ground directly is essentially what this boils down to. As you can see here, I used 10mm spaces between the timber and the wall, and using the Joplast pedestals give me ample of clearance above the ground. As far as the timber touching each other is concerned, the gaps you leave between the decking boards should take care of that. That covers the three main principles I think you need to keep in mind when constructing the substructure for your deck. But something I didn't think of initially but made complete sense when someone mentioned it to me was to create a wire barrier to keep rats and other critters out from under your deck. I didn't record it specifically, but I used this roll of mesh for that, and you can see what I mean on the video. It is a bit of a tedious job to cut and fit the mesh along the perimeter of the whole deck, but I'm glad that I took the time to do it. I don't want to go into detail about laying the deck, but I would like to highlight just a couple of points. The first choice is one of material. Using treated softwood is a cost-effective way to build a deck, and it will last a long time, but a hardwood deck just looks nicer and is much more durable. I knew that I would have struggled to justify paying full price for new oak decking, so I set up an eBay alert for oak, Iroko and cedar decking, so I was alerted of any auctions coming up. It took a couple of weeks, but eventually found a guy that was selling some oak he had left over after a much larger job. I could make a full episode on laying the decking boards, but it is really simple if you build a strong and square substructure. Just take your time to fix the first board carefully and then add one board at a time using plastic shims as spacers to give you a consistent gap. It seems that most people agree on 5mm, but I used 3mm as I thought the wood might shrink a little, which it did. To ensure that you get a tight fit, you can use an inverted hand clamp like this, so it pushes away from a fixed point and squishes the boards together. For outdoor fixings, I use Spax. They're a little bit more expensive, but the quality is excellent, and their website is also very useful for finding the right screws you need. The most important ones, which are these, the deck screws. If you are working with oak, you cannot use steel as the sap in the wood will corrode the metal, so you do need to use stainless steel screws. To make sure it was all tidy, I sanded each of the screw holes lightly and then finished the deck with a hand sander to 120 grit finish. Once I fixed all the boards and cut the ends flush with the facing board, I used the palm router to put a slight bevel at the end to finish it all off. I decided from the beginning that I wanted to let the wood turn its natural silver color over time, as I really like it, especially on oak and cedar. But I wanted to slow it down just a little, so I used 2 coats of Osmo clear decking oil without any UV protection. Now, if you want, you can get oils with UV protection, but in some ways, I think that is just choosing to enter into a battle with the sun, which is one you'll eventually lose. But that's up to you. If you do want to go down that route, a rule of thumb is to go for oils with a darker tint, as this will help protect against the sun. To oil it was quick, as the wood was new and untreated, so the light sanding was all the prep work it needed, and then I just followed the instructions on the can for application method and drying times. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. Please remember to subscribe and click on the bell button so that you can get notifications about the follow-up videos that I'm doing. I am actually considering to do a follow-up video on the deck as well, just because I'm planning to move this cabinet on my right, and then I expect that the deck underneath it will be closer to this color just because it's never seen any sun. So to blend it back together, I might do a video on how I do that. Anyway, until next time, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.